For over 100,000 years, packs of massive wolves hunted across Ice Age America, taking down bison, wild horses, camels, and juvenile mammoths with jaws powerful enough to crack bone. Then, in a remarkably short window at the end of the Ice Age, they were gone. Every scientist who studied them for the next century believed they knew what a dire wolf was. A heavier, more powerful version of the gray wolf. A close cousin built for bigger prey. In 2021, a team of geneticists sequenced the dire wolf's actual genome for the first time. What it revealed did not confirm that story, it erased it. The dire wolf was not a wolf. It was something stranger, older, and far more isolated than anyone had guessed. And the way it went extinct explains something that no fossil alone ever could. The genomic study, published in the journal Nature and led by archaeologist Angela Perry, sequenced 5 dire wolf genomes recovered from fossils ranging in age from 13,000 to more than 50,000 years old. The team compared that genetic material against gray wolves, coyotes, African jackals, and domestic dogs, the full family of species classified together as canids. The result overturned more than a century of assumptions built entirely on bone shape. Dire wolves split from the lineage that produced gray wolves, coyotes, and dogs approximately 5.7 million years ago. Not a close cousin, not a sister species. A separate branch that had been evolving in total isolation in the Americas for nearly 6 million years, while gray wolves and their relatives were still evolving on an entirely different continent. The two lineages looked almost identical by convergent evolution, separately arriving at a similar body plan because a similar predatory role produced similar solutions, while remaining underneath that resemblance, genetically almost as distant as two large predator species can be. Paleontologist John Campbell Merriam had actually proposed exactly this idea back in 1918, suggesting dire wolves deserved their own genus, Aenosian, meaning terrible wolf. His colleagues rejected the idea at the time because the skeletons looked too similar to argue otherwise. The DNA, a century later, proved him right and everyone else wrong. Dire wolves were formally reclassified as Aenosiondirus, no longer even sharing a genus with the animal it had spent 200 years being compared to. The second finding was the one that actually explained the extinction, and it came from what the genome did not contain. Gray wolves, coyotes, dogs, and jackals hybridize with each other constantly. It is one of the defining features of the canid family. Genetic material flows back and forth between species boundaries that in most other mammal groups would be considered fixed. When one population faces environmental pressure, it can often pick up adaptive genes from a neighboring species through interbreeding and adjust faster than evolution through mutation alone would allow. The dire wolf genome showed no trace of this. Despite living alongside gray wolves and coyotes across North America for at least 10,000 years, sharing territory and almost certainly competing directly for the same prey, there is no genetic evidence the two species ever interbred. Not once in 10,000 years of overlap. Every other pairing in the canid family shows this kind of gene flow somewhere in its history. The dire wolf shows none. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. That isolation is what turned a changing climate into an extinction event instead of a survivable disruption. Beginning around 15,000 years ago, the planet warmed rapidly as the last ice age ended. The mammoth steppe, the vast, cold, grass-dominated ecosystem that had supported enormous herds of mammoths, horses, camels, and giant ground sloths across North America for tens of thousands of years, began to collapse as the climate shifted and vegetation changed. The large, slow-moving prey animals, dire wolves, had spent millions of years specializing to hunt, underwent a mass extinction event of their own, driven by a combination of that rapid climate change and increasing pressure from human hunters who had arrived in North America during roughly the same period. The heavy skull, the crushing jaw, The powerful build that had made dire wolves dominant predators of megafauna for 100,000 years became, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, equipment built for prey that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. Grey wolves faced the exact same collapsing ecosystem and survived it. The difference was flexibility. A leaner, more generalized body plan let grey wolves pivot towards smaller, faster prey, deer, modern bison, and elk. The dire wolves were poorly built to chase down efficiently. And where a species with a shrinking, stressed population might normally pick up useful adaptive traits by interbreeding with a neighboring, more successful species, the dire wolf's near 6 million year genetic isolation meant that option was never available. There was no gene flow to draw on, no hybrid offspring to blend adaptability into the population. When the specialized strategy stopped working, there was no genetic escape route left. The species that had ruled Ice Age America for longer than modern humans have existed as a species disappeared entirely, and because it had never interbred with anything, it took its entire unique genetic lineage down with it. Every dire wolf gene, every adaptation built across nearly 6 million years of isolated evolution ended in that extinction. Nothing carried forward. Nothing survived in a hybrid descendant the way, say, some Neanderthal DNA survives today in humans through interbreeding. The dire wolf's own study authors stated the finding plainly. No living members of the dire wolf lineage survive. Sit with that for a moment, because it creates a direct contradiction with the very idea of dire wolf genes existing anywhere today. The genome that solved the extinction mystery also closed the door on any possibility of living descendants. No interbreeding, no hybrid lineage, no genetic thread connecting a modern animal back to a dire wolf. By every rule of natural inheritance, the dire wolf genome should be permanently and completely gone from the living world. For most of the past decade, that was exactly where the story ended. Then, in April of 2025, a biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences announced something that appears to directly break that conclusion. And it requires being explained carefully because what actually happened is more interesting and more limited than the initial headlines suggested. Colossal scientists extracted ancient DNA from two dire wolf fossils, a 13,000-year-old tooth recovered from Sheridan Pit in Ohio, and a 72,000-year-old inner ear bone recovered from American Falls, Idaho. Using sequencing technology far more advanced than what was available for the 2021 study, they assembled a far more complete dire wolf genome from that material, more than 500 times the genetic coverage of any prior dire wolf sequencing effort. That genome confirmed the gray wolf as the closest living relative to the dire wolf, the two species sharing approximately 99.5% of their DNA, despite millions of years of separate evolution, with the remaining 0.5% accounting for millions of individual genetic differences. From that comparison, Colossal's team identified specific ancient dire wolf gene variants responsible for physical traits: larger body size, a wider skull, more powerful jaw and shoulder musculature, and a pale coat. Using research labs, they made 20 precise genetic edits across 14 genes in cells taken from a living gray wolf. 15 of those 20 edits were not simulated or estimated. They were the literal ancient dire wolf gene variants, copied directly from the sequenced fossil genome and written into the gray wolf's cells. Those edited cells were then used to create embryos, which were carried to term by domestic dog surrogates. Two pups, Romulus and Remus, were born in October of 2024. A third, a female named Khaleesi, was born the following January. All three are alive today on a large, secured ecological preserve in the United States. Subscribe to not miss the next one. Here is where the story requires precision rather than excitement. What was born was not a dire wolf, in the sense the species existed for 100,000 years across Ice Age America. Geneticists outside the company, including Colossal's own chief scientist, have been direct about this. A wolf carries roughly 19 to 20,000 genes. 20 edits across 14 of them, however meaningful those specific genes are for outward appearance, leaves an animal that is genetically a gray wolf carrying a small number of ancient dire wolf variants, not a resurrected member of an extinct species. Independent researchers have described the result more accurately as a gray wolf expressing dire wolf-like physical traits rather than a true de-extinction. That distinction matters, and Colossal itself has acknowledged it is not claiming genomic identity to the original species, but rather the restoration of specific functional traits. What can be stated with full accuracy is this: for the first time in more than 10,000 years, actual ancient dire wolf DNA sequences, real genetic material recovered from real dire wolf fossils, are being expressed in a living, breathing animal. That is a fact, verified and documented. The wild lineage that hunted across the mammoth steppe, the species whose genome proved it had been alone on its own evolutionary branch for 6 million years and left nothing behind when it died, does not have living descendants walking the earth today through natural inheritance. It never interbred. It never passed anything forward the way its neighbors did. What roams a preserve in the United States right now is not that lineage returning. It is something new. Fragments of a 6 million-year-old genome extracted from a tooth and an ear bone, deliberately placed into a distant cousin's cells by scientists who wanted to know if a piece of an extinct animal's actual DNA could exist in a living body again. The dire wolf, as the animal that once was, is still gone. But for the first time since the ice sheets retreated, a small, precise, engineered piece of what made a dire wolf is, in the most literal sense available to modern science, awake.